Philip Ryan and Jongwoo Kim from the Advanced Photon Source at Argonne, as well as John Liu from the University of Tennessee, who along with Schwa Sanchez all work to integrate the uniaxial stress cells I'll be talking about with the X-ray diffraction capabilities at Argonne. And of course, I'd like to thank all of my funding sources that have made this work possible. So to begin in earnest, our work is broadly motivated by some of the outstanding questions regarding unconventional superconductivity. More specifically, what the role of competing phases and their associated fluctuations have in developing the superconducting state. So it's well known that most unconventional superconductors share a similar phase diagram, whereas the system is tuned via some tuning parameter, a magnetic phase is suppressed, typically ending in a putative quantum critical point, and eventually a superconducting dome emerges, which suggests that the fluctuations associated with this magnetic phase are somehow involved in the superconducting pairing. Now in the iron-based superconductors, there's also the electronic nematic phase, which appears near or simultaneous with the magnetic transition, in which the electronic fluid breaks the C4 rotational symmetry of the underlying lattice. And this nematic phase is also suppressed along with the magnetic phase and ends in its own possible quantum critical point near optimal doping. Furthermore, there are theoretical considerations such as the Monte Carlo results shown here, demonstrating that in principle, nematic fluctuations can lead to an enhancement of superconducting pairing and TC near the nematic quantum critical point. So we have this overall picture in which both nematic and magnetic fluctuations are potentially contributing to the superconducting pairing. So this raises the prospect that if we're able to tune these phases and their associated fluctuations and see how the superconducting state responds, we can gain insight into how all these phases are interconnected. And as it turns out, anisotropic strain is a uniquely powerful tool to couple to these phases. So for example, in the case of nematicity, measurement of anisotropies induced by anisotropic strain, such as elastoresistivity, are a direct measure of the strength of nematic fluctuations above the ordering temperature. On an even simpler level, symmetry considerations imply that the nematic order parameter is directly proportional to the amount of external strain in the same symmetry channel. So by applying strain, we can enhance nematic order and thus suppress its fluctuations. Furthermore, the strong magnetoelastic coupling in these materials implies that anisotropic strain can also act to tune the antiferromagnetic phase. So for example, work from the group of Pengcheng Dai, who's one of our great organizers, demonstrate that the Nel temperature is increased by uniaxial stress. And even more recently, NMR measurements from Nick Kuro's group directly show that anisotropic strain enhances spin fluctuations above Tn. So with these sorts of ideas in mind, the basic idea of our work is to use anisotropic strain to tune the magnetic and nematic phases and then see how the superconducting state responds. So in order to apply strain to bulk single crystals, we use either commercial or home-built versions of the uniaxial stress device shown schematically here, originally developed by Cliff Hicks. So briefly, the way that this type of device works is that a bar-shaped sample is glued across a gap in a titanium scaffolding, which is attached to 3 piezoelectric stacks. And then by applying voltage to these piezo stacks, we can modulate the size of the gap and thereby apply strain to the sample. Furthermore, by cutting the shape of the sample appropriately, we can control the symmetry type of the strain that we're applying. So the data I'll be showing you has the crystal cut along the 110 direction, which will induce a mostly B2G type symmetry strain, which is the appropriate type for coupling in the ways I described on the previous slide. And lastly, all of this work is in the cobalt-doped barium iron arsenide system, which has the following temperature composition phase diagram. And let me start with an underdoped composition of 4.2%, which exhibits all 3 nematic, antiferromagnetic, and superconducting transitions as the temperature is lowered. So the first set of data I'd like to show you is the effective strain on the resistive signature of the superconducting transition. So you're looking at the resistivity as a function of temperature of the underdoped sample for different amounts of both compressive and tensile strain given by the color bar. So the first thing to notice is that for small values of strain, which are these green curves, the resistivity above the transition changes by a large factor, while the transition temperature itself is relatively unaffected. Now, this is readily understandable due to the presence of nomadic domains, which are present because for this composition, the superconducting transition occurs below the structural transition. So for small values of applied stress, the effect is just to align these twin domains while no individual domain experiences any strain. And the large resistivity change we observe can be attributed to the large resistivity anisotropy that's known to exist in the orthorhombic phase. And then for higher values of strain, so that would be the red or blue curves, the crystal is fully detwinned and begins to distort microscopically. And then we observe the superconducting transition to be rapidly suppressed. And this suppression is even more apparent if we plot the resistivity on a logarithmic scale, where we can see that we actually measure a non-zero resistivity down to our base temperature of our system. So quite strikingly, we can seemingly completely suppress the superconducting state with strain. So this sort of broad resistive transition raises the question of how to properly define the boundary of the superconducting state. In particular, we would like to see a bulk thermodynamic signature of this strain-tuned transition. So this motivated us to measure the magnetic susceptibility at fixed temperatures and variable strain, which we did by measuring the mutual inductance of a susceptometer coil pair mounted above the sample on the strain cell. So here I'm showing you the real and imaginary parts of that signal as a function of strain. And here each color corresponds to a different temperature. And these are offset for clarity. So looking first at the real part, at high temperature, there's zero signal for all strain, indicating the sample's in the normal state. And then at lower temperature and low strain, there's a negative diamagnetic signal consistent with a superconducting Meissner screening state. And then by applying either enough tensile or compressive strain, we can suppress that diamagnetism. And then looking at the imaginary part, that suppression comes along with a sharp peak in the imaginary part, marked by these black squares, which is a standard dissipative signature of a superconducting transition. So we can take this sharp feature as a bulk thermodynamic exit out of the superconducting state. And this mirrors what we see in the corresponding resistivity data at fixed temperatures, shown here on a logarithmic scale, where by applying enough strain, we can destroy the zero resistance state. So we can combine this data into a single strain temperature phase diagram, where the green circles mark the rho equals 0 boundary, and the black squares mark the Meissner signature. And we see we have this dome-shaped phase boundary with a flat region corresponding to the detwinning region, and then these very steep sloped lines corresponding to the suppression. And this phase diagram also includes this color map, which gives the power of the sample's IV curve at that point. So blue is a value of 1, which gives linear ohmic behavior. And so what we see is that extrapolation of these phase boundaries to zero temperature imply that we can tune a superconductor to metal quantum phase transition as a function of applied strains on the order of 0.5%. So in the underdoped compound, we see that anisotropic strain has a drastic effect on the superconducting state. Now, in the context of thinking about the competing phases, remember that in this composition, the sample has already undergone both pneumatic and antiferromagnetic transitions. So when we apply B2G strain, we're enhancing both static pneumatic and magnetic order, and thus suppressing both types of fluctuations. Furthermore, by enhancing the magnetic order, we're presumably increasing the number of carriers gapped by the antiferromagnetic phase. So perhaps it's not so surprising that we see that superconductivity is so drastically affected. But this raises the question of what we'll see in optimally in overdoped compositions without long-range magnetic order, because in this case, we expect B2G strain to actually enhance anisotropic spin fluctuations, while at the same time suppressing pneumatic fluctuations. So here I'm showing the effect of strain on the superconducting transition for the compositions indicated. So you're looking at resistivity on a logarithmic scale as a function of temperature. And looking first at the optimally doped compositions, which are these top two sets of curves. Remarkably, we see a huge sensitivity of TC for both tensile and compressive strain. And at 1% compressive strain, TC is reduced from 25 Kelvin to almost 5 Kelvin, so a nearly 5-fold reduction. Now, this huge sensitivity is greatly reduced as the doping level is increased. So for the 8.8% composition, TC is much less sensitive. And then for the more overdoped 11.3% sample, it's even less sensitive and no longer symmetric for positive and negative strain. So we can understand this evolution a bit better through some basic symmetry considerations. When we apply uniaxial stress along the 110 direction, we don't just induce the anisotropic B2G strain, but we also induce some amounts of symmetry conserving A1G type strains. And then symmetry then dictates that TC can depend linearly on the A1G strains to lowest order, but only quadratically on B2G. So this evolution from quadratic to linear behavior is a signal of a loss of sensitivity of the superconductivity to the anisotropic strain as we move away from optimal doping. And we can quantify this by normalizing by the zero strain value, fitting a second order polynomial and extracting the coefficient alpha, parametrizing the sensitivity. And we can plot that as a function of doping. And what you see here is that alpha is quite large at optimal doping, so approaching values of 100,000, and indeed shows a strong striking compositional dependence. So the measurements I've shown you so far suggest the following temperature, composition, strain, schematic phase diagram, in which in the underdoped and optimally doped regions near the nematic and magnetic quantum critical points, TC is extremely sensitive to anisotropic strain, enhancing the broken symmetry, and in fact can generate another superconducting dome tuned by strain instead of doping. Now, these findings are interesting for a few different reasons. So one, in the case where superconductivity can be completely destroyed, this provides a platform for studying a superconductor to metal quantum phase transition in a bulk 3D system with strain as a clean in situ tuning parameter. And two, it's a direct demonstration of the importance of the fluctuations of the competing nematic and magnetic phases, because in the same sample, we can use strain to strengthen or weaken those fluctuations and see how the superconducting state responds. So this is what makes the huge sensitivity near optimal doping so intriguing, because as I mentioned, in that case, we are outside the magnetic phase. We expect to be increasing the strength of spin fluctuations, and yet we still see the superconducting state weaken considerably. So perhaps it really is the nematic fluctuations that are important for producing a high TC. So to strengthen this point, let me use my last couple minutes to discuss the Elasto-Hall measurements, where we can directly confirm that we are in fact enhancing spin fluctuations in the optimally doped sample. So to perform these measurements, we use the same uniaxial stress device, still applying stress along the 110 direction, but now we're performing a 5-point measurement, which gives us access to both ρxy and ρxx. So let me begin by just describing the phenomenology of what we observe. So here I'm showing you the Hall resistivity as a function of magnetic field of the optimally doped composition, and this is at a temperature of 27 Kelvin, just above the superconducting transition, for different amounts of both compressive and tensile strain. And we can see that the strain is having an effect modulating the Hall resistivity. And furthermore, the response is fairly linear, allowing us to extract the Hall coefficient, which I'm now plotting here as a function of strain. And what you can see is that the behavior is dominated by a nonlinear response, with both positive and negative strain increasing the magnitude of RH, making it more negative. And strikingly, this effect is quite large. So with 0.5% of strain, we see over 100% change in RH. Now we can also measure this quantity a different way by fixing field and sweeping strain instead, which results in this blue trace. And these two methods agree, and this latter method is much quicker, which allows us to then track the temperature dependence of the behavior, which I'm now showing here. So this is the same type of fixed field variable strain trace of the Hall coefficient as a function of strain, with each color corresponding to a different temperature. And what you see is that this phenomenon is strongly temperature dependent, with the large nonlinearity developing at low temperatures. So we can compare this behavior with the simultaneously measured elastoresistivity, shown here on the bottom. And this also exhibits a strong nonlinear component at low temperature. And by symmetrizing this data about zero strain, we can isolate the change in the average in-plane resistivity, which by symmetry must be proportional to the square of the anisotropic B2G strain. And we can compare this to the normalized change of the Hall coefficient. So what you see here is that both of these isotropic quantities have a response to strain that is dominated by a strongly temperature-dependent nonlinear response to the B2G strain. And notably, the Hall coefficient is actually even more sensitive than the resistivity, if you look at the numbers here. So at first sight, this is quite surprising because the 0th order interpretation of the Hall coefficient is that it's a measure of the carrier density, or equivalently, the Fermi surface volume of the system. And since anisotropic strain is a volume-preserving distortion, although we expect it to change the shape of the Fermi surface, we don't expect it to change its volume, and thus don't expect it to change RH. Now, this is only true as long as we don't induce long-range magnetic order when we apply strain, because that would open a gap and reconstruct the Fermi surface. But we see no evidence that that is occurring. Instead, we just see a smooth evolution down to 0 strain, with no sharp feature indicating a magnetic phase transition. So how can we explain this giant nonlinear change in the Hall coefficient? So it turns out that there are previous theoretical works which actually provide a consistent explanation of our observations. And the upshot of these calculations is that in multi-band systems like the iron pnictides, hotspots resulting from interband scattering from spin fluctuations can completely change the character of the minority carriers. So in this case, causing holes to behave like electrons. And this behavior drastically alters the transport coefficients, in particular leading to a large enhancement of the Hall coefficient as a function of increased spin fluctuation strength.
I finished that lecture.
So with these ideas in mind, we see that the large nonlinear Elasto-Hall effect that we observe can be interpreted as a transport signature of strain enhancing stripe type spin fluctuations in this composition. Okay, so that brings me near the end of my time. So let me just summarize and conclude. So I've shown measurements demonstrating the effects of uniaxial stress inducing anisotropic strain, what the effects are on the superconducting state in the cobalt-doped barium iron arsenide system. And the effect turns out to be quite drastic, with strain proving to be an efficient tool for tuning TC. Furthermore, the way that this response varies as a function of composition provides insight into how the competing phases of nematicity and magnetism and their fluctuations relate to superconductivity. So in the underdoped case where we have long-range magnetic order, strain is able to completely destroy the superconductivity, resulting in a putative superconductor to metal quantum phase transition. More surprisingly, in the optimally doped composition, TC is still hugely sensitive to and suppressed by anisotropic strain. And this is particularly interesting in light of the nonlinear Elasto-Hall measurements, which I argued is a unique transport signature of strain enhancing stripe-type spin fluctuations. So this may provide evidence for the importance of nematic fluctuations for the high TC. Now, I should say that there are many other possibilities here and caveats to that statement. So for example, we are not considering how the elasto-nematic coupling may be varying across the phase diagram, which I believe Matthias will be discussing in the talk directly after this. Additionally, anisotropic strain is expected to enhance the strength of stripe-type fluctuations, but perhaps it is isotropic spin fluctuations or other types that are actually important for the superconductivity. In any case, I think our work motivates a more careful study of the effect of strain on the nematic and spin fluctuation spectrum across the phase diagram and how that correlates with the effect of strain on TC. So with that, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Paul, for the great talk. Any questions from the audience? Oh, so I saw Amalia is already raised.
Yes, I have a question, if possible.
Sure.
Yeah, very good. Well done. This is a very nice piece of work. My question is about the second part of your talk, in particular about the Hall effect. So when you apply strain, you expect that you affect both the longitudinal component of resistivity, but also the transverse component. So how do you, can you say something about the two components of your resistivity tensor?
Yes, so let's see.
Because you compare, I assume, only with longitudinal component, but in Hall effect, you will symmetrize and anti-symmetrize your data. So you will have access to, let's say, a rho YY component.
Oh, I see. Yeah, so It's a little bit. So you're saying rho XX versus rho YY? Those
right,
two
yes.
different, yeah. So the thing is that when we're measuring this the way that we're doing this measurement, we don't have a direct access to rho YY. Although, like, according to the symmetry, we basically, when you're at compressive strain, you're measuring one component of the resistivity. And when you're on the tensile strain side, you're measuring another component. So basically what we can access is we can access this component, which is the average resistivity. So that would be rho XX plus rho YY. And then by anti-symmetrizing this data, we could also access rho XX minus rho YY. So this component exhibits this quadratic increase, which suggests that there's increased scattering in the average resistivity. The anti-symmetric component, which is rho XX minus rho YY, that is basically giving you the nematic susceptibility of the sample. So that's why you have this sort of anti-symmetric linear component. And that basically, here I can show you actually. So that basically looks like this on the right, which basically is consistent with a diverging nematic susceptibility. So I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Well, I just thought it's good to think about when you measure Hall effect, things become more complicated. And yeah, maybe you have more information there you can extract from the data.
Yeah, so the data that we show for the Hall, like this data, for instance, we actually do anti-symmetrize the data. So we measure a positive and negative field and sweep strain, and then we anti-symmetrize that set of data. Yeah.
Okay, and about the Hall effect, so can you extract something about your carrier density by doing a multi-band analysis of your data and to see what happens under strain with the carriers and mobilities?
So yeah, we can in principle do that. Although if these theoretical works are correct, which it seems like our data is consistent with what they're saying, then actually the Hall coefficient is not simply interpretable in terms of a multi-band situation. So actually these results that they derive, they actually represent a failure of the Boltzmann transport. Like it's beyond the multi-band simple formula that this sort of thing, because if you just look at the numbers, this would suggest that the carrier density is changing by a lot. Like even in the
in a single band model, I assume.
But yeah, but even in a multi-band system, even in a multi-band situation, this giant change is actually not very easily explainable. Like the numbers don't seem to suggest that you could be able to change the magnitude of this by this amount. So that's kind of what motivated us to look at these sorts of ideas, where they actually directly show that this sort of change can occur.
Okay, well,
Yeah,
it's good.
yeah.
I mean, I assume you do have access to your rho XX and rho XY components. So in principle, you should be able to try to fit simultaneous them and see what you get.
Yeah, that's a very great suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So we have 3 more questions. I guess Pavel is next.
Yes, when you compare TC obtained from Meissner and resistivity in the low strain region, there seems to be that the resistivity transition kicks in quite a bit above the Meissner transition. Does it suggest that the formation of domains, perhaps the superconductivity at the domain boundaries, is occurring at a higher in the bulk without the domain walls? I'm talking about low strain region. You see the
Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether that tells me that the superconductivity between 10 and 8 is due to domain walls or something like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure. So I know that there's previous work shown that the critical currents or the pinning of the vortices actually depends a lot on the domains. So when you detwin the crystal, you actually can get changes in the critical currents, for instance. And so I think that might also help explain this, because you see that the thermodynamic measurement is quite flat, whereas the TC measured by resistivity is actually changing by a little bit here. So I'm not sure. I haven't thought too much about what you just said, but I think that's a very interesting idea. And I think that definitely at least in terms of measuring TC by resistivity, the domains definitely can have an effect. I'm not so sure about the thermodynamic measurement. I think that should be independent of domains.
But the resistive transition is in zero field, is measured in zero field. So the vortices shouldn't matter there.
Yeah, sorry, I misspoke. I just meant the critical currents depend on the domains and the density of the domains.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think
thank you.
For most of the superconductors, the Meissner transition is always, in experiments, is always slightly lower than the resistive transitions. You just need a zero resistant path in order to have zero resistance.
Right, but here it's more pronounced when you have twinned sample. That's
right. So yeah, to quantify this, will be an interesting problem. So Johanna, I think you're next.
Thank you, and thank you for a very nice talk. I was just wondering if you've done this in the B1G channel, because I think you can also have A1G strains squared that could couple quadratically to all these orders. I don't think that's actually the case in this system, but it's something to consider. Yeah, okay.
Yes. So yeah, you're definitely correct in that symmetry also allows the square of A1G. So here's the B1G measurement, and the effect is much smaller there, and it's essentially linear. So yeah, you're exactly right that this type of measurement is required to conclusively show that is the case. And yeah, here's the data.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Great. So last question is from Peng Chen.
Yeah, so I was curious on the so you see the very large suppression of TC. So then you said there's no a static order induced. But I mean, does your diffraction experiment show whether the prediction height actually changes? I mean, under sort of the string that you can apply. I mean, I'm trying to understand. I mean, which way you're pushing the phase diagram. I mean, we know in the case of phosphor doping, when we put a C-axis pressure, you actually push it to the antiferromagnetic order state. So I was very curious. In this particular case, I mean, I guess you don't know. As the previous, the question asked, right? That you don't know whether the electron or hole is increasing, but what's actually changing when you put the pressure on?
So, so when you apply uniaxial pressure on one side of the strain, you'll be increasing the C lattice, and on the other side, you'll be decreasing it. I think the fact that we see the same effect for both positive and negative strain kind of shows that it's an effect of it's a coupling to the in-plane orthorhombicity that's causing this change.
Yeah, but the in-plane orthorhombicity, I mean, it's always coupled. But typically people argue that it's due to the hopping of the electron through the prediction, right? I mean, typically it's always argued. I mean, but yeah, I guess you have a good point. I mean, so in both compressor and tensile strain, you see suppression, but it's very curious, yeah.
Yeah, so in terms of which way we're moving the phase diagram, I mean, you can sort of think of it as we're enhancing orthorhombicity. So it's a little bit complicated, yeah.
But that means you're pushing to the left, right?
Yeah, you're pushing to the left. But I'm not sure if there's a direct, yeah, so you're saying that maybe you are inducing antiferromagnetic order. But so at least in the optimally doped composition, we don't see that. But yeah, in the underdoped sample, I mean, there's already static antiferromagnetic order, and
it's clearly enhanced under the.
And we're enhancing that, yeah. So yeah, I think that's a very good question. And what exactly is happening in the optimally doped composition in terms of magnetic order or not magnetic order, and how the magnetic fluctuations are changing? Yeah, that's basically something that we're very interested in understanding.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I think Peng Chen, this means that it's your turn to do the neutron measurement.
No, but
near the optimal dome.
under this large strain is very difficult. I mean, yeah.
Right, but compression, no, we can still compare and then see if you can see an onset of indifferent error.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, so Chunbyao has a questions.
I have a very short question. I think I may have missed something, but I found this whole response to be very intriguing. So I just wonder. So with longitudinal resistivity, you have the elasto resistance, which is very large. With the Hall coefficient, can you define the analog of that quantity?
So the Hall coefficient should not respond to linearly to anisotropic strain, because by symmetry the Hall coefficient is it's an isotropic quantity. So
that's why it's quadratic.
That's why it's quadratic, right?
Thank you. Yeah.
So what you could define is this quadratic coefficient, but that's something different. So that's kind of why this is so surprising, is that we see this huge change in a quantity that we didn't expect to respond.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so this will be the analog of the nonlinear elasto-resistive coefficient. And Johanna has a paper on this.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Okay, great. So we should move on to the next talk. Thank you, Paul, again. The next talk will be given by Matthias Ikeda from Stanford University. And Matthias is going to talk about a very new and powerful measurements, elasto-caloric effect. So Matthias, the floor is all yours.